officially kick us off, I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners on the land on which we gather and pay my respects to their elders past, present and emerging. I'm currently in Melbourne, so I'm on Wurundjeri land. I want to introduce myself. My name's Danielle Toon. I'm an Associate Director at Evidence for Learning. I'm responsible for our early childhood education work. I've spent the last few years of my career working in Far North Queensland in Cape York, working in primary schools. And I'll pass over now to Dr Sally Stanton and Dr Sandy Houen to introduce themselves.
Hi everyone, I'm Sally Stanton. I'm up in Queensland at the moment. It's a different part of the world, but it's nice that we can do it this way. I am a researcher. I research primarily children's development and do a lot of work in early childhood education care space. And I've been doing that work for about 10 years and looking forward to sharing with you today.
Hi everyone, I'm Sandy Houen. I work with Sally Stanton at the University of Queensland. My claim to fame, I suppose, is actually being an early childhood educator before transitioning into research. And now my passion is to investigate quality in early childhood and children and early childhood really. So I look forward to sharing some practical strategies a little bit later today.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Sally and Sandy. Well, welcome to the webinar this evening on oral language development. Thank you for giving up your Tuesday evening to learn with us. The aims of this session is to really share some of the research on the importance of oral language development. I'm sure you're all interested in that as you've signed up for this topic. And we also want to share some evidence-informed strategies to support the development of oral language in 2 to 5-year-olds. So the research we did specifically that will inform what we share this evening is based on that age range, but it does, but some of what we talk about can be used for younger children or older children. But then on the flip side, some of the specific strategies covered in the research for older children or younger children may not be particularly mentioned. And that's where some of the professional discretion comes in based on your own experience of how you apply the evidence that we talk about tonight. We're keen to try and make this session fairly interactive, given it is a webinar. You won't be able to unmute yourself or turn your video on, but we really strongly encourage you to chat via the chat box, and we'll run specific activities to allow you to do that. And then later on in a webinar, we'll be all able to contribute to the Padlet where you'll be able to share responses to certain prompts. The other thing I want to mention is all the resources we talk about, including the systematic review that we'll mention and our oral language tip sheets, are all available for free online from the Evidence for Learning website. We'll have a link at the end as well as a link to our contact details so you can access all that information. And as I mentioned earlier, we'll also put the recording on the Evidence for Learning website in the next week or so. So to start off with, a bit about Evidence for Learning if you haven't heard of us before, and we've got some new people joining us this evening who may not know a lot about us. We're an evidence broker and we exist to help educators increase learning by improving the evidence of what works for whom and under what conditions. So our vision is an Australia where evidence-informed approaches increase learning so that all children, regardless of their background, make the best learning progress possible. So we're a non-for-profit, we're independent of existing bodies and we work across all states and territories and sectors. So for the last 5 years, we've worked in the school sector, and now for the last 18 months, we've expanded our work to the early childhood education sector. So we work with researchers like Sally and Sandy at the University of Queensland. Professor Karen Thorpe from the University of Queensland chairs our Expert Reference Council in Early Childhood Education, but we also work with a lot of educators at C&K, Good Start and many others around the country. So those working with children, educators are at the centre of what we do, and we support their decision making by building, sharing and encouraging the use of evidence. So as I mentioned, the evidence we present tonight is to inform your professional decision making. It won't be a recipe to follow verbatim, but Sandy will talk a little bit about that later on in the webinar. The 3 main things that Evidence for Learning does is we build new evidence. So we've run 4 high quality rigorous research trials in schools, and we're in the process of commissioning 2 new research trials in early childhood education, one of which will be run in partnership with the Queensland Department of Education. We share evidence summaries, which I'll talk a little bit more about next. including our early childhood education toolkit. And we encourage the use of evidence through webinars like this one tonight and the other resources that we'll mention later on this evening. So why oral language? So this is a preview of our early childhood education toolkit, and the toolkit contains 12 approaches in early childhood education that's based on about 1,700 research studies from around the world. It also includes Australasian research summaries on these 12 approaches, so you can see both the global evidence and the Australasian evidence. So for each approach in the toolkit, we show the average cost, the average months of learning impact, and the average evidence security. And evidence security is the quality, quantity, and consistency of the evidence. So for oral language or communication and language approaches, as it's labelled in the toolkit, it is a low-cost, high-impact strategy with lots of high-quality and consistent research evidence behind it. And so when we run our workshops with educators, I think this is a workshop we ran with C&K, they actually build a bridge using our Lego for communication and language approaches, saying it's a bridge, it's a stepping stone to all be able to access all the other approaches in early childhood education. So I thought that was a nice representation of why oral language development is so important. But to talk a little bit more about the research on oral language, I'll hand over to Sally now.
Thank you. Sandy, have I got access to this now? Yes. Thank you. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about, I guess, why we're here, why are we talking about oral language, and then I'm going to pass to Sandy, who's going to do the bulk of what we're going to do this afternoon, which is to talk about some practice strategies that come out of the research. So what is oral language? Well, obviously, if you've joined us today, you probably have a fair idea of this, but just as a reminder, we're talking, when we talk about oral language, not just about expressive language, so the things that children say, whether that be through words or actions, but also their receptive language, so what they understand and the knowledge they take from the world around them. And obviously, oral language is really critical in terms of not just, I've got a bit of a lag here with my screen. Anticipated, there we go. Oh, I've done it. There we go. It's not just important for us in terms of being able to communicate, although that in and of itself is an important function and skill for when we have particularly small children, being able to articulate and share their needs and wants and ideas with the world around them. But it also has an important place in terms of prediction of later life outcomes. So we know children's language development can have big implications to their learning and a whole lot of developmental things as they go through their lives. So when we talk about language, just to remind everyone, we're talking about a developmental phenomenon. So the three characteristics of something developmental, of course, is that they follow a recognisable path. So we know that anywhere in the world, regardless of what language you speak, there are some really predictable steps, whether that be going from early babbling sounds all the way through the first words and then multiple words and then going into sentence and applying grammar, etc. So this path is universal, and for most children it will be seen as something that they will progress through. However, like anything developmentally, it's not something that happens at the same time for everyone. And language is a really interesting one in terms of language development. We know that, for example, the first word for children in a normal range can happen anywhere from 12 months to 2 years. So that's quite a broad range. And that's similar to other things like learning to walk or talk, or language seems to have a broader range than some of those other areas. Part of this too is that we also know that part of the influence of that is going to be genetic, partly to do with your own personality, how extroverted you are, how willing you are to take risks and try new words, etc. But it's also going to be highly influenced by our environment. What that means for us as educators is that we have an important place to contribute to children. So it's both a challenge, because if children are not exposed to opportunities and to practice and to hear and to express oral language, we know that that can have a big impact on their development. But it also means that we have this absolutely fantastic opportunity to contribute to children's early development by providing these rich opportunities for oral language. There's a particular place, of course, where this plays a huge part, and we know that for children who are living in disadvantaged communities, there can be massive differences by tens of thousands of words between what children are exposed to in those early years compared to children who might be exposed to more rich oral language places. And again, that's where early childhood education care has a really important part to play. Now, if that isn't enough to convince you, and you do happen to work in the early years sector, sorry, it's flipping when I do this. There's also a directive, I guess, a policy requirement that we do support children's early oral language development. I'm not going to read that out to you. Those of you who work in the sector will be extremely familiar with this area, but just a reminder that it's also a really important part of the professional work that early educators and teachers do. In saying that, despite that, some of the evidence that sits around this is quite surprising. And if we think about the experiences of individual children, when we have classes, which can be up to 24 children, and one adult or educator in that space, the amount of time that children spend in interactions, one-on-one interactions, which is where a lot of this rich conversation can occur, certainly with an adult, although there are a lot of peer conversations that happen. But in terms of educator-child interactions, it's surprising how much time we don't have interacting with children in terms of oral language development. And a lot of the time we do have often can be quite minimal. It might be to do with routines or instructions or following particular tasks. And that elaborated, extended, rich conversations that we're going to be talking about tonight sometimes can be incredibly challenging to find opportunities to do. And part of, I guess, one of the things we want to raise is that because of that, we have to be really thoughtful about how we make moments matter. So how do we actually find opportunities to have rich conversations with children, given the constraints and the challenges of the work that educators do? So that brings us to our first task to get us a little bit more interactive here, and we're not just going to talk to you all for the next hour or so, is that we're going to ask you, just in your webinar chat there, and some of you already clearly know what they're doing because you've entered your information, just to do a little bit of a reflection for us about what you think for yourselves or for those you work with are the key barriers to engaging in extended conversation with children. And also the second one is to provide an example of what one of the, or an opportunity might be in terms of providing chances or spaces to support extended conversations with children. So if you just want to have a moment to have a quick think and put that in, I'm going to give you about 30 seconds. It won't be a quick period of time, no pressure there. And then we're going to move on to some other parts. Time, yes, time when you're doing all sorts of other programming, cleaning, working with parents, setting up activities. Got another time. I think the gift of time is one of the biggest things educators probably could be given. Interruptions, yep, absolutely. I guess time is also an opportunity too, but I suspect that's not what that's being framed as. Yep, so children's personalities, absolutely. So how children, you know, a rich oral conversation is a two-way phenomenon. It's not a singular. And so having that willingness and that engagement, and that's a really good point, because today hopefully we'll give you some strategies that might support that. I've certainly had evidence about being supportive in that regard. So distractions, limited supervision, absolutely. Yes, children who are language rich and take over conversations, absolutely. Balancing all of that. Educator-child ratios, we've got that there. And not being able to understand children's speech. Yeah. So finding those opportunities to allow children to communicate and being able to engage in that two-way communication, and using some of those times like lunch times, for example. Thanks everyone. I'm glad you're all awake at the other end. That's good. Very nice for a Tuesday afternoon. So in terms of the strategies that Sandy's going to take you through today, I'll just give you a little bit of a brief background. I'm not going to go into detail around this, but essentially this work comes out of a systematic review, as Danielle has indicated. So for those of you who are familiar with that or maybe unfamiliar, systematic review is essentially where we pull together all of the available evidence around a particular question, and we synthesize that. We look at the quality of that evidence, and then we draw conclusions about what we know from research as a whole. So as opposed to a single piece of work, this is really looking and synthesizing everything that's available. Some things about this particular systematic review: it was focused primarily on strategies that had been shown to be effective in ECEC settings, so in early childhood education and care, as opposed to interactions between, for example, parents and educators, where there might be other, parents and children, where there might be other challenges, but there is also the benefit of having perhaps more opportunity for one-on-one time. So this is really looking at how do educators enact strategies to help rich conversations with children. It's also focused primarily on Australasian research and research coming out of Australia and New Zealand, although it does map onto research in other places in the world. And it's focused primarily, as Danielle said, on children aged 2 to 5 years, but of course that doesn't mean that these strategies may not be useful for anyone. Indeed, as Sandy will tell you, she sometimes uses them on her teenage son at times when she needs some rich conversation with a teenage boy, and of course with younger children too. However, it's not comprehensive, and I'm sure that there are all sorts of other strategies for those other age groups that may be available and may be very valuable. So I'm going to hand over to Sandy here and let her take you through the rest of today.
Okay, I think I'm in control. We're going to move on to some strategies, so practice tips and examples for supporting rich conversations with children. So the Australasian research evidence suggests that rich conversations with children aged 2 to 5 years are fostered when educators create opportunities for children to contribute to conversations, and also when educators implement strategies that help to keep the conversation going. So those back and forth, joint attention and prolonged back and forth conversations. Tonight we'll look at the specific interactional strategies that have been highlighted in the research base that Sally was just talking about. We would recommend adding these strategies to your interactional toolkit so that you can employ these strategies intentionally when you're interacting with children. Some strategies will work better with some children and others might work better with other children. So it's really about you drawing on your professional knowledge of children as well as having knowledge of the interactional resources at hand. Did I just skip 2? Sorry. So for a child to be able to practice using their oral language skills, they first of all need to have opportunities to talk. So the research evidence says that there are particular strategies that support us as educators to create spaces for children's talk. These strategies involving balancing the power dynamic between educators and children, pausing and questioning. So we'll look at these strategies in a little bit more detail, one by one. So children's oral language development can best be supported by educators and children being equal partners in conversation. So that is educators and children having equal opportunities to talk and equal opportunities to contribute their own knowledge, ideas, feelings and thoughts. So being an equal partner in classroom interactions can actually be quite tricky to accomplish, because traditionally classroom interactions are made up of what we call as the IRE pattern. So this initiation, response and evaluation pattern is basically the underlying interaction in traditional classroom settings. So this pattern includes an initiation, which is usually from the teacher, and it often takes the form of a question. A response is usually given by the child to answer the teacher's question. And then typically the child's response is assessed or evaluated by the teacher to say, yes, you're right, or no, you're wrong. So in this pattern of talk, adults automatically take 2 out of the 3 opportunities to speak. So their initiation and the evaluation turns. Educators in this situation are also positioned as the experts or knowledge holders in the evaluation turn, where they assess children's answers. So this uneven balance influences children's opportunities to speak, excuse me, and imposes a power relation in a power relationship in relation to knowledge in the classroom. So some children will choose not to contribute their ideas because they're fearful of being assessed as incorrect or correct. They're just fearful of being assessed, full stop. So to alleviate this imbalance, we need to be intentional in balancing the scales. Pausing and questioning are two strategies that have been shown to create spaces for children's talk, and we'll look at those in more detail now. So pauses have been shown to be an effective tool for encouraging children to participate in conversations. They're powerful because, first of all, they slow the interaction down. They provide time for children to process the talk and construct a response. They also allow children to initiate a turn. So if there's a pause, children might actually take a turn at talk instead of the teacher initiating all of the questions all of the time. Pauses also enable educators to make intentional decisions about their responses to children's talk. So it's actually giving you time to process what the children are saying as well and respond using the strategies that we'll talk about today. So while pausing seems to be a relatively simple strategy, for us adults, particularly teachers, it's actually quite difficult to do. We don't like pauses in conversation. We actually do things to fill those pauses. You might have heard the pregnant pause term. So research that has looked at everyday interactions between adults has identified that a 1 second pause or a 1 second of silence is problematic, and people do things within the interaction. For example, they might take another turn at talk, they might repeat the question. They do things to fix that problematic silence. So if we think about that in terms of our interactions with children, 1 second for children to listen, comprehend, formulate a response isn't very much time at all. So what we recommend in classrooms then is make pausing intentional, even though it doesn't come as easily as you think. We'd recommend trying to vary the length of time you pause for and use your knowledge of individual children. Pause for longer with children who you know might take a little bit more time to comprehend or to process, or take time to formulate their thoughts. So let's now move on to the second strategy of questioning. So before I tell you what I know about questioning, I'm going to hand it over to you. So if you use the chat box again, and if you could just make sure you select, you're sending the chat message to all panelists and attendees. I'd like you to jot down or brainstorm what you know about questions. And I'll start the timer. So we've got open-ended. They can be open or closed. There are different levels of questioning. Information-seeking questioning. Can feel like an interrogation. They can encourage participation. At the same time, you'll see how sometimes they can actually close down participation as well. Wondering versus demanding. I like that one. And I'll tell you why shortly. It's a way of gathering information. Yep. A good question creates more questions for both the educator and the child, I would assume. So we'll keep moving, and that's great. And I will tell you why I mentioned wondering. Well, you'll see why I mentioned wondering shortly. Yes, you do need to be careful of leading questions as well. Okay, so questions are espoused as a way to encourage children to talk. So as we've seen in the comments, most of you, if not all of you, have heard about closed and open-ended questions. Open questions are associated with higher order thinking, and we were talking about levels of questioning as well. Closed questions usually call for short one-word responses, which limit opportunities for children to engage in longer turns at talk. Siraj Blatchford and Manny in 2008 in the UK analysed adult questioning in preschool classrooms and found that 94.5% of the questions adults asked were closed. So you can just imagine all of the opportunities that potentially are not being seized by asking those closed questions. So the questions we ask in classroom life are quite different to how we use questions in everyday life when talking with a friend. For example, in everyday life, when you ask a question, it's normally because you don't know the answer. But in classroom contexts, Educators often ask questions to which they already know the answer to. These have been labelled as test questions in the research, and basically test questions require the child or the children to produce the answer the teacher is looking for, or basically to guess what's in the teacher's head. Research has shown that children as young as 2 can differentiate between a test question and an authentic question. Test questions tend to reinforce the traditional IRE pattern that I spoke about previously, and therefore restrict children's opportunities and sometimes willingness to contribute to conversations. Here's why I like the wondering. During my PhD, I actually investigated I wonder questions to find out how teachers use them with young children and to understand the interactional consequences of using them. So my research found that teachers use them to position themselves without knowledge and to afford children agency or autonomy in the classroom. They presented teachers as curious and interested in finding out. And the strategy worked as an invitation rather than a mandate that you must respond or you must give me an answer so that I can assess it as correct or incorrect and to test the child's knowledge. I also discovered that after using I wonder questions, teachers were much less likely to evaluate a child's turn at talk. So that really disrupted that IRE pattern, where the evaluation turn was actually taken away. So let's have a look at 2 examples taken from my PhD. Before we do, I would like to acknowledge my supervisors, Professor Susan Danby, Professor Anne Farrell and Professor Karen Thorpe. They were all at QUT at that point in time, and I also thank QUT and the Australian Research Council for providing funding for me to conduct this research. So in these examples, a teacher with the pseudonym of Lisa was seated at a laptop computer with 2 children who I've named Mina and Rory. So they all participants are pseudonyms. Mina and Rory had decided to do a web image search for bugs that they might find in their kindergarten garden. This search idea actually emerged during the whole group time just prior to inside play, when the children started talking about some bugs that they had found in their kindergarten garden during the previous weekend when they had a working bee at the kindy. So in this example, the teacher and children had located images of lady beetles, and these images became the focus of the conversation. So during the conversation, the teacher asked, "What's that?" You can see here, "What's that?" is a WH question. And she was pointing to the antenna of a lady beetle. This WH question seems to be problematic for the child, and the problem is indicated in the child's 1.6 seconds of silence on line 158. So what the teacher did, she then initiated what we call a repair in conversation analysis. So she reformulated the question and to an "I wonder." So she said that the teacher then modified her question to "I wonder what that is" in line 159. And this resulted in Mina actually having a go where she said "eyes." And although the child responded with the incorrect answer, the teacher did not assess. What actually happened was another child seated with them during the interaction contributed his idea and did label the antenna as antenna. So here, the original child had the opportunity to learn something new within the conversation and without losing face for being incorrect. And the information and possible new knowledge came from the unfolding conversation rather than from the teacher using a transmission of knowledge approach, as in, "I'm the holder of all knowledge and I will tell you the answer that I'm looking for." It became much more conversational. So let's look at a second example. So in this second example, it's the same teacher. The teacher starts with an "I wonder" question. Wonder what kind of turn into. Mine's saying my internet connection's unstable. I hope everyone is okay with me. I wonder what kind of butterfly it would turn into, and this resulted in the child proffering his ideas about hairy caterpillars turning into hairy butterflies. And what he does do is he doesn't just label that, he actually provided a justification about his thoughts, and he said, because it's a hairy caterpillar. So you can see that's actually a higher order or a higher level of thinking, and also being able to communicate why he thinks a hairy caterpillar might turn into a hairy butterfly. So the teacher then followed along a similar question, but she didn't use the I wonder. She actually just started with the WH question, asking what would their cocoons look like. So his response was actually, I don't know. Now, although I can't be sure, I would sense that if the teacher had have used I wonder what their cocoon would have looked like, potentially the child would have given a justification about it looking hairy because it's a hairy caterpillar and a hairy butterfly. So here you can see how the I wonder formulation helped to position the teacher as curious rather than an expert or ultimate holder of knowledge, and invited children to contribute their knowledge, thoughts and ideas without casting judgment by assessing children's contributions. But it did not stop the sharing of factual information between the interactors and the teacher and children. So in this way, the knowledge was co-constructed. Importantly as well, the formulation helped to disrupt that IRE teacher-child interaction and made the interaction much more conversational, as I mentioned before. Okay, so is that our solution? Can we simply pause and ask questions to promote children's contributions to talk and conversations? Unfortunately, it's not that easy. Let's delve a little bit deeper into questions and questioning. So while asking questions is a very important strategy for engaging children in talk, the categorization of questions into specific types, such as open or closed, is not that easy. I can remember when I was back in my undergrad days reading something that said, if you just ask WH questions, so who, what, where, when, or why, it's going to be an open question. That's not the case, and I'll explain why shortly. While some question designs do lend themselves to a particular category, for example, is the sun white? Is the sun white seems to be a closed question. It's not always the case. As you'll see in example 2, that same question that was asked by the teacher, example 2 shows how the child did not align with the yes/no question. Instead, they chose to provide a longer answer that enabled them to use their expressive language skills and to provide a more detailed response. Let's have a look at another example in which the question seemingly looks to be open, but it's not. So in this example, the question asked by the educator could initially be categorised, if you are only looking at the question type, as an open design. What's up in the sky? There's many answers to that. We see here the child responds with clouds and the teacher responds with, oh, actually I was looking for plane. So here, the teacher's response to the child's answer indicates that it was actually a closed question. She had an idea in her head that she was actually looking for. So these examples show that we simply cannot look at the questions asked to categorise them as open or closed. Questions must be considered as part of the sequence of talk, factoring in the child's response and also turns following the response. So moving on now, the Australasian research shows us that responding to children's talk is also vital to foster those ongoing and reciprocal conversations. In the literature review, we found 2 main themes that supported conversations to be shared and ongoing with children, and offering children opportunities to contribute just as much as adults. The themes relate to making links to children's personal lives and responding to children's turns at talk. So naturally, children are the experts of their own lives, so we'll have more to contribute to the conversation if children's own experiences, ideas and interests are the focus. You can help a child make personal connections to current events by creating space and time, even though it's a challenge, making time to link conversations to children's experiences, following children's lead to identify and incorporate their interests into the conversation, making connections to children's worlds in order to personalise conversations, and encouraging their ideas and opinions to indicate that their contributions are actually valued. The research evidence illuminates 4 strategies to tap into children's personal lives. And these strategies, I must point out, were identified in specific contexts. So for example, the reminiscing approach and the book reading approach was identified when educators and children were talking about children's learning stories or their learning portfolios or photographs of children in action in the classroom. The reminiscing approach was used by educators to prompt children's memory to tell a story about an entry in their portfolios. Conversely, the book reading approach was used by educators to read the learning story entry as if it were a book. The reminiscing approach was found to encourage a child to talk more and produce more complex talk, whereas the book reading approach was found to expose a child to more complex speech. So it's recommended that educators actually vary their approaches and not solely choose one and stick with it. You want children to hear more complex speech, but you also want to give them opportunities to talk about their own lives so that they can use complex sentences as well. Second stories and pivots are strategies that connect children's own experiences to current conversations. So although you may not be familiar with the term second stories, I'm sure you'll all know them once I give you an example. So second stories are offered after an initial story. So for example, you're sitting in group time, a whole group morning time as the children have arrived, and a child arrives late to class and comes in and says, "Oh, I'm sorry I'm late, my car broke down." So a second story can be provided by either another child or an educator who also makes a personal connection to the original story of the car breaking down. So for example, another child might say, "Oh, my car broke down on the weekend too. We had a flat tire and my mum had to change it." Pivots connect immediate events to personal experiences and usually contain 3 steps. For example, 2 children are building a sandcastle in a sandpit. They have made a moat and are filling the moat with water. The water is absorbed by the sand. Every time the child fills the water up, it disappears. And one child actually makes a personal connection by saying, "When I was at the beach on the weekend, the water kept disappearing from the pool that I had made in the sandpit." So the teacher might actually build onto this connection and say, "Oh, how did you solve that problem?" as a way of getting the child to talk, but also as a strategy to solve problems that they encounter in the classroom. Okay, so what we're going to do now is actually look at a video. A lot of you may have already seen this video. It's been doing the rounds on Facebook. We'll watch it twice possibly. The first time I would just want you to watch and enjoy it because it's beautiful. The second time we'll watch it, but I want you to think about the strategies that we've discussed today. Think about the strategies that this father uses to create space for his son's talk and also to keep that conversation going. So if you could add your strategies to the Zoom chat box, that would be fantastic.
Okay. They need to work on that, right? Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right, don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do that here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
So we'll watch it again, and this time if you think about the strategies that we've spoken about, but you might even identify some new ones. I think I just did as well. as we watched it. So feel free to add it to the chat box while it's playing this time.
Okay. They need to work on that, right? Yes, okay. Did you understand it though? No. Okay. All right. Huh? Oh no, not this one. This is the grand finale of this. Yeah, that's the last one. That's what I was wondering. I don't know what they're gonna do next season because they did some stuff this time. Exactly what I was thinking. Oh yeah. Right. Don't bring that again. You know what I'm saying? Don't do the same stuff. You know what I'm saying? Yeah, I was thinking that. Yeah. Yeah. Like go somewhere else with that, but don't bring it here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's what I said. And then it was like, you know what I'm saying? And I was like, what in the world? But don't do that here. You know what I'm saying? Yeah. Really? I thought the same thing. We think a lot alike, huh? Oh, that's crazy. Right.
Yeah, I'm looking at the comments, and the things I was thinking were gestures, which you've written, hand gestures, eye contact, mirroring the child, valuing, balancing the power. He's wondering and acknowledging what the child is saying. Julia loves the use of his non-verbal, and it reflects the child. Lots of pauses. So you can see, and what the child actually started to do was initiate turns at talk when there was some silence. The child actually started initiating as well. So as we said before, these strategies can relate to very young children as well. And shared humour. And I think that's about that connection, isn't it? The relationship. So thank you very much for your contributions there. Okay, so this is where we're going to, so the final activity for you is you'll actually go out to the Padlet here. So for those of you, if you've already opened the Padlet on a new page, what I would like you to do is I want you to take some time to think about how you, A, create spaces for children's talk in your interactions, and B, how you keep conversations going with children. And what I want you to think about is, I want you to think about it in terms of stars and wishes. So I really want to highlight that we are doing things really, really well. So first and foremost, I want you to think of two things, so 2 stars in your practices for each A and B that you do really well. And then I want you to think about a wish, something you wish you could get better at, or you wish to improve in terms of creating space for children's talk and also keeping the conversation going. So what you need to do is, I'll click out. So you'll need to go into your own browser and add using the plus or the addition symbols. And we've already got some up there already. I think some people did their, well, not that there was any homework, but some people did some prior reading, which is fantastic. But just take some time to think about what you do really well, because educators do amazing things that I think sometimes we just take for granted, and we just think that that's normal common practice, where I think it's underestimated how much you actually do. So people are exploring children's interests. They're very good at that. Sharing funny stories. Showing genuine interest in what they say. Listening. Remembering what they say to you too. Yeah. And that by remembering and building on what children have been doing, I think is really powerful. A, it sends the message that you're interested, but it also means children are the experts. So you're positioning them with expert knowledge. So some of the wishes, using appropriate discourse markers to allow them to keep talking. And by discourse markers, I'm assuming you're saying using little tokens like tell me more. Not that that's a discourse, but encouraging the children to keep going, making eye contact. For keeping the conversation going. So some people are very good at directing the conversation, being able to bring the conversation back from a tangent, but I'm assuming you're letting them actually go out on a tangent as well. And I think there's actually a fine balance to that, because when you're following the children's lead, they're going to contribute, but also you have your own teaching goals that you're trying to get back to as well. You'll be able to access this Padlet after, but we'll also download a copy, and I'm pretty sure Danielle will be able to send a copy of this out to everybody who's joined as well. So some people are wishing that they could select the right question at the right time, and my hint there is to actually use your pause. You don't need to fill that silence. Pause. Think about the question, and sometimes you might find children will initiate that turn at talk anyway. So we'll guide you rather than being dependent on you to constantly navigate and shape where the interaction's going or where the conversation's going. Yes, the long day care setting I think is quite tricky in terms of being able to continue learning conversations over time. And I'm assuming that's if the child doesn't come back the next day, they only come twice a week, by Friday they've forgotten their interest. I would suggest utilising the photos to remind them of what they were doing when they were last at the service, or using conversations with parents to find out what the children have been interested in as well. So I might leave that there, but we will certainly be able to share the Padlet with you once we've finished. So before we finish, I would like to reiterate that the strategies that we've spoken about, they're not recipes, they're not formulaic. They are tools to be put into your interactional toolkit for you to experiment with, for you to explore, for you to find out what works for you and what works for you with individual children as well. Your familiarisation with the strategies and having an understanding of how these strategies work in interactions will assist you as professionals to make those intentional decisions about the strategies that you will use in your interactions with children. They'll help you to select the right tool for the right job as the interaction unfolds. I'm going to hand back to Danielle.
Thanks so much, Sandy. That was fantastic, and we'll give you a chance to rest your voice. I know you're not 100% well, so thank you very, very much for sharing all your incredible knowledge, both from your early childhood educator career and your research career, for all those really practical tips. So all of this information, both what Sally mentioned in terms of the systematic literature review and the tip sheets, are available on the Evidence for Learning website under Early Childhood Education. You can also read a bit more about the overall research in our Early Childhood Education Toolkit, both on communication and language approaches and the other 11 approaches in the toolkit if you want to find out a little bit more information. Also really handy if you're studying and you've got some research assignments you need to do. It's a great starting place to look up the current core research, both from a global context and an Australian context. So you're welcome to download those and share them in your settings. They summarise everything that we've talked about, including some tips for sharing and experimenting and reflecting. So that also aligns with a CEQA's kind of requirements in terms of critical reflection. So now we have a little bit of time. We don't have a lot of time, but we have a little bit of time for questions. Thank you to the people who submitted questions in advance. Sally spoke a little bit about the normal development ranges. We didn't specifically study normal development ranges and developmental delays, particularly in relation to oral languages, as part of the systematic literature review. It didn't come out really clearly, but I will mention briefly that our partners, our evidence partners in the UK, the Education Endowment Foundation, in the next few days are about to put out their guidance report on special educational needs. So if you're looking for particular information about special educational needs with a strong evidence base, we can share that resource with you. It's for a UK setting at the moment, but it will contain a synthesis of the global evidence on that particular topic. And we can obviously, if we've got access to other pieces of research on that specific topic, we're happy to share those references as well. I'm just going to check if there's any questions. There's our contact details while we're getting some questions into the chat box. You're welcome to contact any one of us. And also please sign up for the Evidence for Learning newsletter and our Twitter and Facebook, because we regularly share our resources on there that you can access. Okay, was that timeline again for the special educational needs paper from the UK? That's coming out on the 20th of March, I believe. So in a few days, we can share the link to that in our follow-up email from the webinar. Is there a good data gathering tool that we can use, especially in schools? We might have to come back to you on that one. Obviously, Sally and Sandy work in the early childhood education space. We're doing a little bit of investigation to look at formative assessment tools more broadly in evidence for learning, in particular some that Good Start are using, but we don't sort of have a definitive view on that at the moment. We might be investigating that over the course of this year, so stay tuned on that one in terms of early childhood settings. There are some tools to measure language development, and the one I'm thinking about specifically comes out of the University of Wollongong and is called the Early Years Toolbox, and you can access that online for free, and it's research-based. It may or may not meet the particular needs that you're after. It is designed for early childhood educators at this point in time, but they are looking at extending it more broadly into the early years of schools. Yeah, the comments were fantastic. I just want to echo that as well. Thank you, everyone, for contributing your knowledge. As we mentioned, we will save and share the Padlet. And before we go, given we've got a few minutes left, we'd really encourage you now to fill in the feedback form, the feedback survey. It's really important for us. It's designed specifically for this webinar and about the oral language topic. If there are specific things you want more information about, or a format that you find it easier to design, have the resources delivered to you in, if you like the webinar time, if you like the resources, you can kind of give us any feedback, and we too take that feedback really seriously and on board. There's a link on the screen at the moment. There's a link in the chat box, and as soon as you log off the webinar, the link will pop up as well, and we'll also send it to you in an email with the webinar wrap up and with all the other links we've mentioned this evening. So very keen for you to fill in the survey and give us all your rich feedback. But once again, I want to thank you very much for giving up your Tuesday night to join us. Hopefully it was useful. Please tell us what was useful and what you'd like more of, and we'll endeavour to provide that for you. So thanks again. Have a lovely evening.